The War and the Boy. The Vietnam War was one of the longest and most devastating conflicts of the 20th century. It reshaped not only borders and politics, but the lives of millions who lived through its long years of uncertainty. Villages that once echoed with the sounds of harvest and celebration became silent landscapes marked by fear. The war did not discriminate. It touched the lives of soldiers, farmers, parents, and children alike. In the heart of the countryside, surrounded by rice paddies and narrow dirt paths, stood a small village. The people there lived simply, tending to their crops and families. Among them was a boy, no older than 10, whose life revolved around daily chores, feeding chickens, fetching water, and helping his mother in the fields. His father had gone to help defend nearby towns and had not returned. Each morning, the boy walked to the village well, balancing a wooden bucket tied with a frayed rope. The well was more than a water source. It was a meeting place, a landmark, and in many ways, the center of their fragile existence. The war was never far away. Sometimes, distant gunfire rolled across the hills. Other times, aircraft thundered overhead, leaving behind trails of smoke. The boy had learned not to flinch, not to ask questions, and not to stray too far. Yet beneath the fear and the caution, life continued. Children still played in the fields when it was safe. Families still cooked simple meals together. Even amid destruction, there was a quiet determination to endure. For the boy, the war was an abstract thing. Something grown-ups spoke of in whispers, something that changed where he could walk or when he could sleep. But one ordinary afternoon, that distant conflict would step directly into his path, changing the course of 2 lives forever. The lost soldier, deep in the heart of the Vietnamese jungle, an American soldier named Thomas Miller, stumbled through the thick undergrowth. The jungle seemed endless, an ocean of green that swallowed light and sound. The air was heavy, the kind of air that clung to skin and refused to let go. Thomas had been separated from his platoon 3 days earlier after a chaotic ambush on a narrow trail near the Mekong Delta. Gunfire had erupted from both sides, echoing off the trees. Smoke and confusion filled the air. In the scramble to find cover, Thomas had darted into the forest. And by the time silence returned, he was alone. He had tried to retrace his steps, calling out softly for his unit. But only the insects replied. The jungle was deceptive. Every direction looked the same. Paths disappeared behind vines. Water trickled somewhere nearby but was impossible to reach. He carried his rifle slung across his chest and a pack that grew lighter by the hour. His rations were almost gone, and his canteen was half empty by the end of the first day. The humidity made it feel like he was breathing through cloth. Thomas was 21. Back home, he had worked at a gas station in Kansas before enlisting. His letters to his mother were full of confidence, promising that he'd come back stronger, wiser, maybe even proud. But in that jungle, stripped of direction and surrounded by the unknown, confidence meant very little. On the second night, he built a small shelter from branches. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the distant sound of movement, monkeys perhaps, or something else. Each time a twig snapped, he reached for his rifle. Each time the darkness shifted, his heart quickened. By morning, thirst was his greatest enemy. His canteen was dry. The streams he found were muddy and stagnant, undrinkable without purification. He pressed his lips to a damp leaf at one point, desperate for moisture. Hours passed. The sun climbed high. His steps grew slower, his vision blurred. He thought of home, his mother's kitchen window, the way the light hit the curtains in the morning. He thought of cold water, of ice clinking in a glass. By the 4th day, exhaustion and dehydration blurred the edges of reality. His legs trembled, his voice cracked when he tried to call for help. Then, somewhere through the haze, he saw something. A faint column of smoke rising straight and thin against the sky. It was a village. Thomas moved toward it, staggering more than walking. His boots caught on roots. His rifle slipped from his shoulder, dragging in the dirt. The jungle seemed to close around him like a curtain. He stumbled into a clearing, his body swaying under its own weight. He reached for his canteen, but there was nothing left. The metal felt hot to the touch. A few more steps, and then his strength gave out. He fell hard to the ground, his face in the dust. The world dimmed. His last thought before losing consciousness was of water. Clear, cold, life-giving water. A moment of compassion. That same afternoon, the boy walked toward the village well. The air shimmered with heat, the kind that made the world seem to hum. He lowered his bucket, listening to the creak of the rope as it descended into the cool depths below. As he turned to leave, a faint noise reached his ears. It wasn't the sound of birds or wind. It was something else. A muffled groan, soft and human. Curious but cautious, the boy followed the sound down a narrow path lined with tall grass. Each step was hesitant. The stories he had heard about soldiers filled his mind. Strangers with strange weapons, men who brought both danger and destruction. But curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, pulled him forward. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he froze. Lying half in shadow was a man in a dirty uniform. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, his eyes barely opened. Beside him lay a helmet and an empty canteen. The boy's first instinct was to run, but the man didn't move. There was no weapon raised, no threat, only weakness, the kind that made even an enemy look human. The soldier lifted a trembling hand toward his canteen. But there was nothing left inside. The gesture was faint, almost pleading. The boy stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, after a long moment, he made a choice. He stepped forward. Slowly, silently, he approached the fallen man. The soldier's eyes followed him, glassy and uncertain. The boy knelt beside him, lifting the bucket carefully. With one hand, he tilted it, letting a small stream of water flow into the soldier's cupped palms. The man drank, then again. Each sip seemed to bring him back from the edge. His breathing steadied, his gaze softened. The boy poured a little more water, careful not to spill. For a few minutes, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The act itself was enough. The boy's eyes met the soldier's, and in that exchange, one of fear, kindness, and gratitude, something universal passed between them. When the bucket was nearly empty, the boy placed it beside the man. He looked toward the village, then back at the stranger. He knew he couldn't stay. There were risks. Soldiers from both sides often passed through, and helping anyone could bring danger. But before he left, the boy reached out and pressed his small hand gently against the soldier's arm, a gesture that needed no translation. Then he turned and ran back toward the village, the sound of his bare feet fading into the distance. The soldier watched him go, his vision blurred but his heart clear. That single act of kindness, a child's decision to help a stranger, would remain with him for the rest of his life. After the war ended. But for those who lived through it, peace did not come easily. Thomas returned home in 1975, thinner, quieter, and carrying invisible scars that no doctor could treat. The sound of helicopters still woke him at night. The smell of rain on hot pavement reminded him of jungle storms. Crowded rooms made his chest tighten. He tried to build a normal life, found work as a mechanic, married, raised 2 children. Outwardly, he seemed fine, but deep inside, the memories never left. He often sat alone on the porch at dusk, watching the sun sink low and thinking of faces he could no longer remember. But one memory remained vivid, untouched by time. The boy's small hands, the bucket of water, the way the sunlight had caught in the droplets as they poured into his palms. In that moment, Thomas had seen something pure, kindness that existed even when the world seemed to have lost it entirely. He would tell the story to his children sometimes, not about the firefights or the loss, but about that boy. He described him as the bravest person I ever met, though the boy had never held a weapon. His children grew up hearing the story as a kind of parable, a reminder that humanity can survive even in chaos. For Thomas, the boy's face became a symbol of hope. Whenever life felt heavy, he thought of that act, a moment of mercy that had saved his life and restored something far deeper, his belief in people. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the boy, now a man named Nguyen Van Minh, was living a modest life as a farmer. His village had changed over the decades, where once there were craters and burned trees, now there were fields again. The land healed slowly, just as the people did. Min often visited the old well. He still remembered that day vividly, how afraid he had been and how that fear melted when he saw the soldier's desperate eyes. He had never told many people about it. It was something personal, something sacred. He sometimes wondered if the soldier had survived. Whenever he drew water, he would look into the rippling surface and think of that pale, trembling face. The war had taken so much: friends, family, time, but it had all given him one unexplainable moment of purpose. Years turned into decades. Both men grew older, their memories separated by distance and history. Yet somewhere, beneath the noise of life, they both carried the same image: a boy with a bucket, a soldier on the ground, and a kindness that refused to fade. The search across decades. It began quietly, almost accidentally. Thomas was now in his late 60s, retired, and spending most of his time in a small home filled with souvenirs of his past: faded photographs, medals, and a single dog tag that had never left his possession. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box, he came across a notebook from his time in Vietnam. Inside, between pages stained with sweat and mud, was a rough sketch, a drawing he had made long ago of the boy by the well. Something stirred within him. He realized that he had spent his life remembering but had never truly searched. What if the boy was still alive? What if he could thank him, not as a frightened soldier, but as a man who had been given 50 more years of life because of that one act? At first it seemed impossible. The war had displaced millions. Records were incomplete. Villages had changed names, been rebuilt, or disappeared entirely. Still, Thomas began writing letters to veterans organizations, to journalists, to embassies. Most replies were polite but discouraging. "Too much time has passed," they said. "It would be impossible to find one person after all these years." But Thomas didn't stop. Every night, he read about Vietnam's post-war history, tracing old maps, comparing locations. He spoke with other veterans, hoping someone might remember the region. Months turned into years. Then one evening, while watching a television special on post-war reconciliation, Thomas learned about a humanitarian program helping veterans revisit the places where they had once served. For the first time, he felt hope. He applied immediately. When the plane touched down in Ho Chi Minh City, Thomas felt the air hit his skin, hot, humid, and oddly familiar. Memories flooded back. The sound of motorcycles, the chatter of markets, the distant smell of rice fields. Vietnam was no longer a battlefield. It was alive. Again. He met with a local guide, a man who had grown up hearing stories of the war from his own father. When Thomas told him his story, the boy, the bucket, the village near a well, the guide grew quiet. He said there were many such stories, but perhaps, with patience, they could find the right one. Days of travel followed. They visited small villages along dirt roads, speaking with elders, showing them the old sketch. Some nodded politely, others shook their heads. Many had never heard of such an encounter, but one woman remembered hearing something as a child about a boy who once helped a lost foreign soldier by the old well near her family's home. The lead was faint, but Thomas followed it. When they arrived at that village, he saw fields stretching toward the horizon and the faint outline of an old well. Children played nearby. Farmers worked in the distance. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth. The guide spoke to a man sitting near the road, his face lined with years of labor. When the man heard the story, he smiled faintly and nodded. "That boy," he said softly, "was my older brother." The world seemed to stop. The guide translated. Thomas stood frozen, his heart pounding. The man continued, explaining that his brother still lived nearby, still tending his farm, still drawing water from that same well. Arrangements were made. The meeting would take place the next morning in the village hall. That night, Thomas barely slept. He sat by the window of his guest house, listening to the night insects, thinking of the decades that had passed. He wondered what he would say, whether the boy, now an old man, would even remember him. But deep down he knew the truth. Neither of them had ever forgotten. The reunion took place in a small community hall near the countryside. The air was thick with humidity, the same as it had been all those years ago. When the soldier entered, his steps were slow but steady. Across the room stood an elderly man with gentle eyes and hands roughened by years of farm work. They looked at each other in silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, almost instinctively, they moved toward one another. When they met in the center of the room, the soldier's voice broke as he whispered a simple word. "Thank you." The two men embraced. There was no need for translation. The moment spoke for itself. They sat together, sharing stories through interpreters, but much of what passed between them was unspoken. The soldier spoke of how that act of kindness had carried him through his darkest memories. The man explained how he had always wondered if the soldier had lived. Later that day, they visited the old well. It had been rebuilt, but the location was the same. The soldier knelt beside it, touched the ground, and smiled through tears. He told the man that this was where he had been reminded what humanity truly meant. That evening, they shared a meal together: rice, vegetables, and tea. They laughed gently about the passage of time and the unlikely friendship that had emerged from war. When they parted, they promised to write, though both knew that words were no longer necessary. Their reunion was covered by local news outlets, but for them, it wasn't about recognition. It was about closure, about proving that even the smallest gesture can bridge the longest divide. Lessons from the past. The story of the boy and the soldier is more than a tale of reunion. It is a reminder of what remains possible even in humanity's darkest moments. Wars end. Nations rebuild. Generations move forward. But kindness, even one act, can outlast it all. That drink of water was never about politics or allegiance. It was about empathy, about one human being seeing another in need. For the soldier, it restored his belief that the world could still be good. For the boy, it proved that courage could take many forms. Sometimes, it is simply the choice to help. Their story shows that compassion does not vanish in war. It merely waits for someone brave enough to act on it. It is a lesson that transcends time and borders, reminding us that the smallest act of humanity can create ripples that last for generations. Today, photographs of their reunion hang in both their homes, one in a quiet American town, the other in a rural Vietnamese village. Two lives connected not by battle, but by kindness. And in that connection lies a truth that history too often overlooks: that amid the noise of conflict, the quietest moments of compassion are the ones that endure. Because wars end, people rebuild. But humanity, when expressed through simple, selfless acts, never fades. Thank you for watching this true story of compassion and reunion. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. It helps more people discover that even in the darkest chapters of our past, humanity can shine through. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, sometimes a single drop of water can change a lifetime.